everybody. We are on the road today. We're in the belly of the beast in Washington, D.C., on the corner of 14th Street and G Street, a few blocks over from the White House, where the American government resides. Of course, for many people, American government is the problem. It's the bureaucracy. It's the thing that the incoming Trump administration wants, in some people's minds, to get rid of. But my guest today, Max Stier, the founding president and CEO on the Partnership for Public Service, a wonderful organization that's focused on making government more accountable, more efficient, more relevant to the 21st century, might disagree. Max Stier, welcome to the Keen On Show.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Max, government suddenly has become an issue. It always was something that hummed along in the background in previous administrations. Is that a good or a bad thing that the American public now is beginning to hear debates about whether or not American government works?
Debate is good. I think some of the choices that are being proposed are not so good and will lead to a lot worse government. But at the end of the day, we need a public that is actually concerned about, invested in, and working to have a government that better serves their interests.
Max, you were a classmate of my wife's at Stanford Law School, so you're all too familiar with the West Coast and some of the perhaps skepticism on the West Coast, in Palo Alto, Stanford University, towards the American government. What's your feeling on the way in which the Trump administration is bringing in guys like Elon Musk to, quote unquote, make government more efficient?
So I think that it's important, again, to activate all elements of our society, and the West Coast, as you say, has been an incredible hotbed of innovation and technologies that I think have the prospect of making our government work a lot better. But like with all things, it depends how it's done. And if Elon Musk is going to engage in making our government work better, that would be tremendous. If he took the time to really understand how our government works today and how his engagements can actually make a positive difference. The challenge can be if you come in without that contextualization, you might wind up creating more harm than actual good. And I think right now we are seeing a lot of ideas that have been bandied about that are likely to take us backwards rather than forward.
Let's try and distill some stuff down, Max, because there are obviously many things the government does well, and there are many things the government does badly. Pick one of each out for you, from your point of view as the on the Partnership for Public Service. What in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century works well in American government, and what doesn't?
So I think you just have to look around at our society and where we are with respect to the rest of the world to immediately see where it's working well. I think the most fundamental responsibility of our government is to keep us safe, and the United States government has done that in a world of tremendous and metastasizing and fast-paced risks. So to that fundamental challenge, it's done an extraordinary job. What it has not done well is really keep up with the world around it, and that is, in my view, a product of leaders in government and frankly outside of government who haven't invested in making sure that the institutions themselves are actually getting better and better. The problem set is changing, the opportunities for addressing them are changing, but the government itself is a legacy organization where leaders are very short-term minded and not minding the store so that the organizations they actually are responsible for are prepared for the challenges of the future.
I'm not sure everyone would agree, Max, with your first observation. Of course, there was 9/11, which some people still see as a major security lapse. There were the catastrophic post-9/11 wars. Is the security state in 2024, 2025, is it really working as efficiently as you suggest?
I think that there are no doubt that the government, and really it's the leaders in government, have made mistakes, and 9/11 is a great example of that. 9/11 really, though, was a wake-up call to understand that we lived in a much more dangerous world than the leaders in our government, or frankly the public, fully understood. But the reality of this is we operate in the #1 economy in the world. We have wealth and freedom and opportunity that is unmatched anyplace else, in a world in which there are a lot of actors out there that would like to stop that from happening. So the fact that we can even be having this conversation right now, I think, is the strongest evidence that our government is working. Can it work better? For sure. Does it need to constantly get better? It does. Do we have leaders inside and outside who are making the investments to make that possible? No.
We could be having this conversation, though, in all seriousness, Max. Many countries in the world, I mean, might even be able to be having it in China. In most of the world, we could be having these conversations, couldn't we?
Well, I think the answer is yes, because you come back to first principles. What is a government intended to do? And it's really our one tool for collective action as a society and in a democracy that has the imprimatur of the public and taxpayer resources behind it. And so, yes, every country presumably ought to be having this kind of conversation. In some places, in most places in the world, there is a better appreciation for the importance and value of the investment in government. In the United States, I think we have a lot of ambivalence towards government, a lot of mythology about what has been accomplished with the expectation that it was without government. And your earliest points about the West Coast and Silicon Valley is a great example of that. Silicon Valley exists in terms of the innovations that have been created there in partnership with government. Government has been an incredibly important venture partner, investing in new things, being an important market, and frankly, a source of a lot of ideas. So, I think that we do see these issues as being relevant across the world for good reason. They're not, and they have not been discussed sufficiently in the United States. And so it is good to hear that conversation picking up. What is unfortunate and problematic is that we're having that conversation in the context around an effort to take our government back to a 19th century system rather than taking it forward to where we need to be in the 21st century.
Well, those you've established those very useful bookends, Max. 19th century system and 21st century system. Let's define that 19th century system. Is the specialness, the uniqueness of America, the relative weakness of the federal government, especially in the 19th century, particularly in contrast with other developing industrial countries in Western Europe like England and Germany. Is that what makes America slightly different? Its different operating system, to borrow a West Coast term for government?
So I don't think that's the issue at play right now. I do think, obviously, our federal system is distinctive. More distinctive, obviously, is the fact that we've operated as a democracy and for a very, very long time. The intergovernmental issues are profound, but the point that I was trying to make in terms of the 19th century is really focused on the question of the core purpose of public institutions. And in the 19th century, we had, especially with the presidency of Jackson in 1824 and 1828, a move to what was dubbed the spoils system, a notion that when you win an election, you have the opportunity to place your partisans and your loyalists in the jobs in the federal government. And that model ended in 1881 when President Garfield was assassinated by a disgruntled job seeker who didn't get what he wanted from the patronage system. The response to that by Congress in 1883 was the passage of the Pendleton Act, which was the first move towards professionalizing our career civil service. So when I use the 19th century as the bookend, I'm really talking about a notion of government that it's there for the benefit of the winner of the immediate election as opposed to the benefit of the public. When I talk about a 21st century system, I'm talking about for 140 years, we've operated with this important notion that our civil service needs to be apolitical and merit-based, people selected on the basis of their capabilities, and that is now being put into question in a very powerful way. Not only the civil service, but the very nature of government, whether it's appropriate to use government power to pursue a private agenda as opposed to fundamentally being there for the public good.
But Max, isn't government always, for better or worse, ideological? It always carries with it and reflects a certain agenda, a certain way of thinking about the world. Between those bookends, of course, there was the FDR New Deal, which radically transformed American government, perhaps the most profound event in all of American history, which came with a set of assumptions. The majority of Americans embraced it. It seems to have been successful, but it had its critics. So are you suggesting that your version, and I use that term carefully, comes without ideology?
No, I think that there's an important distinction to be made between the choices that are made by leaders who are selected through a democratic process that are policy-oriented versus the choices around how the actual infrastructure of our government is used. So there have been debates across the American history about the appropriate size of government, the role of government. Should it be involved in education? Should it be involved in any number of different issues? I believe those are appropriately resolved by our democratic process. Elections choose leaders in the Congress and in the presidency, and they can direct government in any sort of various policy directions. That is distinct from a notion that the government apparatus can appropriately be used to pursue the private agenda of the leader of the day. And those are very, very different things. So yes, FDR instituted a very different notion of the role of government in terms of the places that it would actually intervene in our world, and that has taken place over the years in many different fashions. You mentioned 9/11 earlier. You look at TSA as an example of an organization created in response to the world around us. That was, again, a choice made by leaders at the time. Very different from the idea of saying it's appropriate to go after political enemies with the Department of Justice. It's very different from selecting leaders of government and who are political leaders on the basis of their loyalty versus their competence and character, and very different from the idea of upending the civil service to create, again, a spoil system as opposed to a merit-based system we have today. To my mind, that's not about ideology, that's about the infrastructure of democracy. If we have a government that is no longer ultimately there and accepted to be there for the public good, but rather can be appropriately and understood to be used for the private agenda of the leaders of the day, then we are no longer in the policy difference world. We are in the world of democracy versus some form of autocracy.
Or a form of patrimonialism where the leader behaves as if the government is essentially an extension of his own private court and interests.
Exactly right. And I think that is the issue that we are focused on at the Partnership for Public Service, and it is qualitatively different. So this is, again, not about right or left. It's not about Republican or Democrat. It's not about a policy difference. It's about our notions of the appropriateness of governmental authority being used, again, for the public good versus the private interest of the leader of the day.
Max, I know you're friendly with Michael Lewis. He's a great admirer of you and your institution. In his book, which was, I thought, a very powerful work on the first Trump presidency, first Trump administration, The Fifth Risk, he described what, in his view, happened, this kind of patrimonial assault on the American governmental bureaucratic infrastructure. I know you're familiar with The Fifth Risk. Do you echo Lewis's critique of that first Trump administration?
I'm in good company if I'm with Michael Lewis, and then yes, I think he is an extraordinary storyteller, and I think what he tried to do, and this comes back to some ways to the very first part of this conversation, what he tried to do was to help explain why people should care, what is it that our government actually does, and he used the framing of the handoff of power of the transition to make that case. And he chose agencies that are if not least understood, lesser understood amongst the panoply of different agencies out there, to make the case about why actually what they do is really important for lots and lots of people and our welfare as a nation. But the short answer to your question is yes, I agree with Michael Lewis.
But some Trump people, if they were here, might disagree. They might say, well, government doesn't work, and Lewis has his own particular agenda. He has every right to it, but he can't claim the objective foundations of the argument. Didn't Trump pick people because he mostly didn't like government, and so he found people who simply were disinterested or incompetent to run large bureaucracies, which in his view didn't have any value?
So I don't think that's a really good explanation for what happened in 2016-17 or what is happening today. I don't think this is an issue about liking government or not liking government. It's a question about the appropriate purpose of our governmental authority, and you stated it earlier quite well. It's about whether, again, it's for the public good or for the leader of the day. And so if you look at the nature of the leaders that are chosen, the question is, what kind of responsibility do you have as the ultimate leader of our government for a period of time? And I think the answer should be that you're responsible for choosing people who are going to be able to follow your agenda, your policy agenda, but fundamentally understand that their responsibilities are to the public good. Every federal employee, career or political appointee, swears the same oath, and that oath is to the rule of law and to the Constitution, not to the President of the United States. So what you have to be concerned about is a leader who is searching for somebody who sees their ultimate loyalty to the President as opposed to the rule of law and to the Constitution. And so choosing somebody who is, believes that the institution they're responsible for should take a different direction, that is within their prerogative. Choosing somebody who is trying to destroy the public good, the institution that they are a steward of for a short period of time, that is not right. That is something that should not be happening, and the American public should be deeply concerned when that is happening, because it is their resource, their institution that is being harmed for a bad reason.
But isn't this idea of the public good, isn't this endlessly being debated with respect, for example, to the environment? From the Republican, Trumpian point of view, there is no global warming crisis. It's all being concocted by a progressive media. For the left, the reverse is true. So the idea of this public good, Max, is always in the eye of the beholder.
No, I don't think so. And here's why, which is, you are correct that there is dispute about the importance or the existence of climate change, and that is appropriate debate within the public sphere. But what should not be appropriate is taking apart or destroying the organizations in our government that are responsible for environmental issues because there is a view that climate change is not true or whatever else that might be. The institutions themselves exist to be there to support the American people over time. They can be redirected in terms of their goals, their objectives. That is, to some degree, the prerogative of the president, but in our system with separation of powers, it's actually Congress that determines what these agencies are supposed to do. And therefore, if you're following the rule of law, which is what everybody in the public sector should do, they need to follow the law. They need to follow the directives of Congress in terms of what it is that they're pursuing. If they have discretion, for sure, a president can set a different direction, but they are still responsible to leave our government in a better place when they're done than when they arrived. That's the difference here. It's not about the direction you're driving the car. It's about whether you trash the car or not. You can go in many different directions. The political process enables leaders to make that choice, but it really should not enable them to destroy the vehicle itself.
Maybe using the example of a vehicle is one way of thinking, or perhaps thinking of it as a precious vase or something which one generation passes down to the next. And of course, with precious vases, they can be smashed and they can be broken into smithereens and it's impossible to put them back together. Cars can always be fixed, especially if we have Elon Musk involved. In the first Trump administration, was that vase smashed? Were there examples where the essential value of the public good, Max, was destroyed so that, like Humpty Dumpty, it couldn't be put back together again?
So I will say that I'm not a fan of the vase as opposed to the vehicle, but that's again a fair.
Sometimes cars can't be fixed either. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, the only reason why I think the point of the car is that it actually has utility in a way that it's harder to understand the utility of the vase. Or the reality is that the cars themselves change over time. Like a vase that's ancient might actually be more attractive. I don't need to go down this road too far.
I take your point. It's an interesting conversation.
But yeah. So I don't want to this is not where the more important I think issues are going to.
Although just to come in, I don't want to extend this, but we did a show on how to be a good ancestor from an Oxford philosopher a couple of years ago. And in a sense, government, maybe it's not a vase, maybe it's a vehicle, but it is something in a sense that you're suggesting one generation hands down to the next.
Yes, I think that's true, although even a car is not the best example because it is ultimately people, and this is the most important aspect that I think is lost. A car is a thing still, but our government is a collection of people, and it's one of the, I think, most important lessons from the pandemic was the way, in fact, that our government actually operated quite effectively, even when substantial parts of it had to be doing their work remotely. But let me come to your question, which I think is a really important one, which was, were there elements of our government that were destroyed in the first Trump administration? And what I would say, and this comes back to this notion that it's people as opposed to an object, I would say that our government was damaged in certain respects in that it has come back. And the examples that I would offer you are the elements of our government that were moved outside the DC area. And the theory of the case went by the Trump administration that we would benefit if we had more of our government closer to the people that it was actually serving, and so parts of our government would be moved outside of DC to other areas of the country. First point would be to understand that over 80%, 80 to 85% of the federal workforce itself is actually outside the DC metro area. So the large majority of our government is actually in every county of our country, all over the place, California being, I think, maybe the second largest concentration of federal employees. So that already exists. But in this instance, there were two elements of the Department of Agriculture, both related to research efforts that were moved with great speed outside of DC to Kansas City. And what ended up happening, and when I say move, what that really meant is that the buildings were moved, meaning that instead of having buildings in DC, they put buildings in Kansas City, but over half the workforce quit. And so in effect, the organizations were destroyed. The human capital, the knowledge, the experience, the capability was ended. And it actually cost the American taxpayer more money because they then had to hire back a number of the people who quit and were able to retire, and then had to be rehired and paid both their retirement and their salaries in order to do work that was actually essential for agriculture in our country. So there was a report done by the Government Accountability Office. There was a bunch of damage. It did recuperate after a couple of years to some real cost to the public fisc, as well as to agriculture not getting the research that they needed in the interim. So there is an example where real damage was done to the federal government. It has since recovered. There is now a move to try to do this at larger scale, and that would be a mistake. So hopefully that lesson has been learned. But there are all kinds of ways in which harm was done. I think our government has recuperated in terms of its capability, and I hope the lessons will be learned in a positive way.
Max, on my way to your office, I walked past a place called the Milken Center for Advancing the American Dream, funded, of course, by Michael Milken, a somewhat controversial investor and entrepreneur. Equally controversial and certainly influential entrepreneur Elon Musk created SpaceX to rival NASA. There are more and more of these privately funded organizations supposedly acting in the public interest, although of course SpaceX and the Milken Center are rather different. What would you say to guys like perhaps Milken, certainly Musk, that the private sector can mostly do government, that the NASAs and the federal bureaucracy of the 20th century, the old New Deal state, simply doesn't work in the 21st century, and it's better done with private money in the private spirit?
So look, we have the greatest economy in the world because we have such a robust market system in the United States. And this comes back to the true narrative. The reality is that SpaceX exists because of NASA. It exists because NASA chose a strategy of trying to nurture private sector, components of its mission, and actively work to, and continues to work to try to grow a private space industry. And so, like in so many other places, where the mythology has grown up that this is like all, bootstrap and done by themselves, the reality is, again, it was incubated and grown by, public sector investment and public sector strategy. So there are a lot of things that can be done more efficiently by the private sector than by government. The one thing that the private sector cannot do, that government can do, is more about the guarantor of doing it on behalf of the public's interest. And this is really fundamental. I'm a former antitrust lawyer, worked my first job in government at the Antitrust Division, Department of Justice. We would not have an efficient and effective free market without our antitrust laws and entities in our government that ensure that the playing field is actually a fair playing field. We count on our government to do so many different things that enable the private sector to succeed in ways that generate benefit for all Americans and not just for a few. So you think about, I mentioned earlier, just our physical safety. Could we count on private contractors to make sure that we could address the threat of Russia or China or cyber intrusions? No, we could not. Could we count on the private market to make sure that when we go to the supermarket and buy hamburgers and meat for our kids, that hamburger meat is actually going to be safe for us, or that the water we're drinking from our tap is actually not going to have poisons in it? All kinds of ways in which we need to have a robust capability that is there for the public good and held accountable by the public, looking out for our interests. So there is no way that the private sector alone can replace all that our government is doing. If anything, I think we have to be very diligent in looking at the ways in which we've outsourced a lot of activities to the private sector for bad reasons. So if you look at even the size of our government, there's so much focus today on the head count in the federal workforce, which, by the way, is about the same size as it was in the 1960s. Despite
what are the numbers, Matt?
So there are about 2.3 million civil servants. That is about the same size as it was in the late 1960s. We have over 100 million more Americans in our country since then as well. But if you look at the contractor workforce, those that are paid for by the American taxpayer through the government dollars, no one really knows for sure, but you're looking at many multiples, 3 or 4 times the number of dollars going out to pay for the contractors than you are for the direct federal workforce itself. So, and that would be okay if it were, those private sector choices were done because they were in fact cheaper and better quality and more efficient for our government. But actually, oftentimes it's done because you have rules that constrain the direct federal workforce that the private sector doesn't have to meet, and therefore it's easier to go out and contract, even though it's a worse return for the American taxpayer. So, the broad answer here is we are strong as a country because we have both a effective government and a effective private sector. You could not have that effective private sector without our government. Can our government be done better? Are there rules that need to go away? Are there technologies that should be invested? 100% yes. We need to see big reform in our government, but you can't get rid of it, and you never want to make it subservient to the interests of the leader of the day as opposed to the public good.
It's interesting you note that you would never have had SpaceX without NASA. A lot of people have argued that you could never have had Silicon Valley, or certainly the internet, without the government investment.
No question. No question.
Is what's missing here government presenting itself perhaps more as a for-profit investment arm of the people, so that we've got these multi-trillion-dollar companies in Silicon Valley which benefited from the massive government investment in digital networks and the internet. Shouldn't the Googles and the Amazons and the Microsofts of the world who ride off this public infrastructure, shouldn't they be paying the government back? And might that be a more effective way of financing the public sector in the 21st century?
I don't think that is the right tactical choice. I think the broader proposition is correct that our larger, successful ecosystem of companies has depended upon all kinds of not only front-end investment but current investment in our society that enables them to thrive. I think, as I said earlier, there are a lot of changes that should take place in our government. There are big questions about our tax enforcement system. As an example, one of the things that is really quite striking is that if you don't change the tax laws at all, if you simply collected the money that everybody in fact owes under the current rules, we'd be collecting somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 billion more a year. So this again is not about raising taxes for anybody. It's just simply making sure that everyone who actually owes their taxes pays their taxes, but we have not invested in the arm of our government that is responsible for efficient tax collection in a way that enables it to compete against a lot of private sector, either companies or high net worth individuals who are buying services that enable them to avoid those taxes. So, if you said to me, how do we make sure we have a fair society in terms of who's paying for the services they receive, I'd start with not changing the obligations that people have, but simply enforcing the obligations that already exist, and that would take us a long way to meeting some of the needs that we have to generate the revenue for the commitments that were being made. Technology would be another area where we underinvest in, and I think with the advent of AI, there's clearly enormous efficiencies, and I would argue even better than efficiencies, more effectiveness that we can get from our public sector institutions by its application, but it requires real investment to make that happen. Some of that needs to be done by the executive branch leadership. Some of it needs to be done by Congress. Congress's role, I think, is underappreciated in terms of the inefficiencies that we have, and it begins with, frankly, their failure to pass their appropriations legislation on time since 1996. That's the last time they did it. So again, when people argue, hey, our government should be run more like a business, no business would be in business if they had Congress as their board of directors, because they would not even have their budget for any extended period of time. So it's important to understand these things. I think you raised the broader question about, why isn't there this recognition of the public sector's role? And I would say it's twofold, one of which is there's very poor communication by our government about what it actually does and how people benefit. There's a lot of infrastructure more generally in our society to find problems than there are of infrastructure to find the things that are actually working. And so generally people don't pay attention to the nature of their government until it's not working, until something goes wrong, as opposed to when things go right. The very first point that I made about safety, your first response was, well, what about 9/11? And my proposition to you would be 9/11 was horrific, and it was one incident, whereas we've had a government that has kept us safe from many, 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 many other threats. So being able to focus on what is working is actually important to understand what we're getting from our government, and it's also important in terms of understanding what the solutions are to the problems that in fact do exist with our government.
Yeah, the government's like the IT guy. You never have any issues until something goes wrong, and then you always blame the IT guy.
There we go. Yes, indeed.
When it wasn't his or her fault that it's broken.
Yes.
I'm really pleased, Max, that you bring up AI, because of course this is the new thing coming out of Silicon Valley. Many people believe that, including myself, that it's going to change everything.
Yes.
You've presented government essentially not as a precious vase or even a vehicle, but as a collection of people, of human expertise, which is what AI is, but as a machine, as a smart machine. How does AI challenge your version, or perhaps strengthen your version of 21st century government? I think for guys like Musk, I can't obviously speak on his behalf, but ultimately for them, AI can replace all these government bureaucrats. Is there any truth to that?
So I think that I do think AI is obviously a transformational opportunity, and I'll underscore opportunity because it depends what we ultimately do with it. I think that public sector adoption of AI is important in multiple respects. One is the one you just identified. Can our government actually deliver better services to the American people by using AI smartly? And the answer clearly is yes. Will it mean fewer employees? Maybe. It depends a lot on what we're trying to achieve and how well it's used. And this is a question that's not just facing the public sector, but also the private sector. I think it's important for our government not only to use AI effectively and to invest in it to deliver good services to the public, but our government has a dual responsibility here. One is to adopt in a responsible way in order to provide good services to the public, but it's also the entity that's supposed to be regulating this. So coming back to my point about the broader business climate and the antitrust division and competition laws responsibility in creating that fair playing field, our government has that responsibility with AI as well. And so there are all kinds of interests we have as a society that we can't count on the private sector profit motive to actually adequately represent. We need our government to be able to understand, to have experience using AI, to have the technology understanding, but also the public policy understanding to set the right rules of the road. And this has, national security consequences, privacy consequences, all sorts of things that probably we can't even anticipate. But I do think that AI is something that offers huge benefits potentially, and as with anything, we have to, which has that kind of transformational power, we have to be very thoughtful about how to use it smartly and how to create the right system around it to do our best to look out for the public's interest.
I mean, if AI is applied properly, of course it never will be, but if it is, and you have this body of verified information, perhaps built on some sort of blockchain, both political parties, both sides of the aisle, when they acknowledge the need for this kind of expertise, it can be passed down. It should ideally be transparent so that everyone has access to how it makes its decisions and how we get our data on how government operates.
I think that the difficulty here is, like, at the most abstract level, you're going to get agreement from people that, yes, we want to see better results in return. The challenge becomes when you start drilling down into the specifics and to the application and the implementation. And I think that very few policymakers really understand how our government actually works and how to achieve the goals that they have effectively through our government. And again, this is part of the hole we're in with respect to our government. People love to operate on the policy side of things and not actually understand or engage on the implementation issues that are, in fact, way more important. This is, taking a step back when we look at why our government is falling behind in terms of the world that we're now operating in. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you have short-term leaders not aligned to the long-term needs of the organizations they're responsible for, and those short-term leaders are incentivized to announce policy as opposed to implement effectively good policy. And leaders on the outside push for policy choices without paying attention to that execution, implementation need. So it's the same thing in AI. So yes, at the highest levels, you'll get people to say, yes, there's huge opportunity, but really understanding how to make sure it's adopted effectively. You're not simply replicating old process using new technology. I don't think it's simply a wave of the wand, we create one data set that AI sits on top of, and that's not going to work. Our government's super complicated, and moving the machine, moving is tough work and takes expertise and time and focus, continuity of action. So that's a little messy answer, but this is super important. This is not like a speech by anybody that's going to be able to say this is what we need to do and be done with it. It's actually getting it done that's the hard part.
I want to end, Max, on a personal note. You've dedicated your life as the founding president and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service to the ideals that you're talking about an objective government dedicated to the public good. You graduated from Stanford Law School. Some of your classmates have gone on to acquire great wealth through the private sector. Any regrets of your life choice?
No regrets. I think that I've been extraordinarily lucky to have lived so far. I'm not sure when you say dedicate my life. I hope I have some years left.
So far, at least.
So far, yes.
You're still in early middle age, shall we say?
Yeah, maybe further along than early middle age, but let's leave that as it is. I would say that I've been able to, in my professional life, lead a life of purpose. I can't think of a better way than to do something where I feel I'm making the world a better place, and doing it in a way which I believe has the highest leverage possible. So no complaints. I'm happy for my classmates who have been able to lead lives that are fulfilling for themselves. Everyone's got to choose their own path, and I've been very lucky on mine.
Well, Max Stier, the President and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service. Important work, and in the second Trump administration. Love to get you back on the show to see how or what Donald Trump will be doing in the public or perhaps the private interest. Thank you so much. Real honor to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for doing what you're doing.
He's an expert.